Hello everyone, and welcome to the second series of Through the Magical Doors, a series of conversations I'm having with some incredible, very magical women and men that I feel are doing some really valuable work in the community. And I'm really happy to welcome Delphine to have this conversation again, a really lovely friend and client who we have done a series one conversation as well. So just to say, thank you, Delphine, for being here. It's lovely to have you.
Thanks so much. Always a pleasure to talk with you.
And just to say about Delphine, Delphine is an intuitive guide for divine feminines. She's a psychotherapist, a practicing psychotherapist. So she brings a lot of very valuable integrative shadow work and really embodied work that is really necessary for, particularly for women who are stepping into their intuitive leadership, but also for anybody who resonates working with her, creatives and therapists and coaches. And yeah, she's doing some really wonderful work right now. And we're here today to talk about a specific beautiful course that she's put together, a really beautiful, very affordable course on such a fundamental aspect for our growth and development, which is to do with the inner critic, our inner critic. And so I'm really happy to have a chat with you, Delphine, about this. I would love to know a little bit about how would we define the inner critic? What would you say is the inner critic about, and how does the inner critic show up in our lives?
Yeah, so the inner critic is such a big aspect of our personalities and kind of ourselves that we engage with daily, whether we're conscious of it or not. So a lot of this is very unconscious. But I would say the inner critic is really that aspect of ourselves that's always assessing and judging situations, and judging ourselves in the situation, more particularly. And it's often quite a negative voice. So there's a whole spectrum of ways that the inner critic shows up, but in the most obvious ways, it's the voice that's full of shoulds, like you should do this, you should do that, or else something bad will happen. It's a voice that is kind of telling you that you're not good enough, or that you should be a bit more this or a bit less that. It's constantly kind of trying to make you be a certain way to fit into the situation, or to appear a certain way to others. And it's also not just a voice, it's an aspect of ourselves that is constantly helping us, but the helping part I'll get onto in a moment, but constantly telling us to kind of curate, how we appear, and modify and subtly adapt ourselves, even in the way that you say walk into a room and then you notice certain people are there, whether it's in a work context or even on the street. When you respond to your environment and you suddenly shift your posture to appear a certain way, or there's a very quick process, but it could be like, oh, you should be a little bit more smiley and open, and you should look more friendly, or don't be too over the top, stay quiet in this situation, just pipe down, don't be talking too much. And it's constantly telling you things like that. So the list of things that it could be telling you is very, very long. And I've included, like on the page with the self-study course, I was kind of wondering, should I include this or not? Because it's so private and personal what everyone's voice sounds like. But I wanted to make it really clear, what kind of stuff it could be. So you can have a look at all the examples. I was kind of a bit like exhausted typing the examples, because I was like, oh, it's such a horrible part of ourselves that's constantly, critiquing and making you feel like an imposter, and assessing you during the situation and then after the situation, like, oh, you appeared a little bit too, eager there. Why do you appear so eager? Oh, you shouldn't have said those things. You're not a very spiritual, person, or oh my God, you're a psychotherapist, how could you be saying that at this stage? Or you should be further along in your process.
Yes.
So stop me when you need to stop me, because that can go on.
No. I was saying yes because I resonate with a lot of what you're saying. I recognize it in myself. So yeah.
And it's very personal to, who you are, what kind of person you see yourself as in the world, and what would make you feel bad or ashamed or, less than. So it's really different for different people. And of course, it's gendered as well, and so the things that we need to be as women are certain categories of things. And that's shifting all the time nowadays. But
Yes.
So being strong or being vulnerable or being sweet or being kind or being compassionate. It's also very cultural. So in Ireland, there's certain things that you should or shouldn't be. Otherwise, you're an asshole if you're like too
Yeah.
much, too confident or not, giving things to others first. There's so many, different ways that we are told to adapt,
I'm
or
guessing
else
also religious and connected to a
religious.
spirituality and the kind of norms of the groups that we grew up in and all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff.
all of that.
I'm particularly curious, you said something that really resonates for me, this thing about sometimes it can happen really fast. And because it happens so fast, and sometimes we don't even realize that we're hearing it.
Yeah.
We're operating almost like it's like this invisible voice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how almost like it's when they're invisible, those kind of threats we have in our experience through invisible forces, through hardly unseen forces. So when something operates in such a fast way, that actually like it can end up becoming almost like a little bit more detrimental in the sense of like the power it has over us because we can hardly notice it.
Absolutely. It's
You
really
know,
pernicious is the word for me with the inner critic. It is so sneaky and covert, and
sneaky. Yes.
it's sneaky and it's really pernicious because it's really like persistent, so even when you do uncover it, it's just like constant, unless you're doing the work, which is what this course is, and this work that I do is about, and the work that we all do really in some ways, as healers and coaches and all the rest, is to heal the underlying thing that is causing it. But it is so interwoven, isn't it, into the fabric of our identities.
Totally.
Like the first level is some people, the people I work with tend to have an awareness of it.
Yes.
But in the early days, say, of coming into psychotherapy, you might be so identified with your inner critic that you don't even realize that it's not you. So it's
Of
like,
course.
oh, this is not necessarily the full truth of me and of the world and what the world expects of me. But then, as you say, you can separate out that voice that can be attacking you and constantly telling you, you're so stupid, why do you do that? And it's really very, very painful at times.
It's hard
Very,
to
like,
really,
it can be very misogynist,
it's
very
hard
unforgiving.
and it's like very hard to really, in the process of connecting with our authentic self, right? It becomes a lot harder to do so if we keep on like letting the inner critic take over. So I'd love to know, as I know, like, the women I work with, and we work with kind of similar kind of client groups as well, for women who are coaching, who are supporting others in their kind of process of whatever the process could be, either coming deeper into a connection with themselves to achieving things in the world, right? Through the business or other aspects, whatever the coaches can be, the work can be about. How does our inner critic, I think you partly answered that, but why is this work as important to do? And why do we need to be doing this work if we're going to be helping our clients? And because I can see like a connection there, and how before you put that course, I hadn't even thought about really particularly making it. I do my own shadow work, but I hadn't really thought about fully investigating my inner critic and just seeing like in a way where it can sabotage.
Yeah, definitely can. There's so many reasons why it's important, but I think the inner critic is a really useful kind of delineation or like subsection of shadow work, because it can even get in the way of us doing shadow work. It's just so constantly there that it sneaks into our spiritual process. It stops you from becoming, more of who you really are deep down. It's kind of covering over, and it's almost like you're living the life of somebody else when you're living from your inner critic. You're driving yourself forward from a place of lack and shame and fear and confusion, and it's very much connected to the young self. So we can talk about that more in a moment, but it's shaped in childhood, right? So these shoulds and these voices of your early caregivers, your teachers, your parents, your older siblings, or younger siblings, cousins, whoever it is, neighbors, everything that you internalized, it's like other people's voices. It's not you. It's not the real you. And even I sometimes go, but it is me, like, because it is a part of me. It's a part of self, but it really is not the deeper, sort of endlessly creative, open, expectant, the soul child almost part of you that is really kind of has infinite potential and would not be afraid of doing things if you didn't feel so afraid of rejection and abandonment. So if you're letting your inner critic be there and call the shots in your everyday decisions, which it does, so that's why we need the strategies to engage with it, then you're living from a really limited shadow aspect. You're limiting from an unconscious part of you that has developed to compensate for feeling, threatened and feeling wounded in childhood. You're not living from the deeper, kind of healthier aspects. And what you'll often find as well is you've got the inner critic over here that's saying, do this or else something bad will happen. So we're afraid that if we don't, obey the inner critic, we hate it because it's ruining our lives, and it's just so constricting and scrunching you up into a small version of yourself. But we're also afraid to let it go, because then we're like, well, then I'd never get up and do anything in my life. But that's not true, because what happens is when you're living from the inner critic too much, then the inner saboteur on the other side is like, I'm so sick of living this way. This is so stressful. This is so kind of limiting. I'm just going to rebel. Sorry, not the inner saboteur, the inner rebel.
Right. Okay.
Going on in there. The inner saboteur is there as well, but the inner rebel is like, I'm just going to, whatever, eat loads of chocolate or whatever. That's kind of a cliche example, but it's like, I'm going to stay up really late. I am going to not do anything to do with all the work stuff I wanted to do this week. And I'm going to just get in my own way, sabotage myself, rebel, act out. And neither of those parts of us are the real, deeper self. Which is, you would like to think a more mature part that's gradually evolving from the inner child as well, the kind of healthy inner child into, I want to do this. I actually want to show up for this call today. I want to, and even like stuff like, I should pick up the kids, people kind of like, oh, but what if you didn't do that? And it's like, well, of course you have responsibilities in life. But if it's coming from a place of like, yeah, I want to do that now because that's the right thing to do and I'm responsible for this, that's a different energy, and that's a healthier, it's not a kind of a self-martyring energy. It's more of a sovereign, autonomous, mature, healthy person energy than if I don't do that, that'll mean I'm a crap parent. If I don't do that, I'll be an awful friend. Those kind of criticisms are a different tone, and I think we all know that.
It's interesting because what you talked about, the two extremes, is kind of one of the things I teach is about the crazy eight, which I learned during my coaching accreditation, and it's the crazy eight being the kind of two extreme key signature extreme behaviors that each individual gets to find homage in, right? Like to take refuge in. When we we struggle really kind of connecting with what's really going on, and then we have different vehicles how we fit into these behaviors. And for some people it could be like from anger to depression, from another one can be to like this kind of like really engaging into the sort of destructive behavior of the inner critic, to then going into the sort of rebel, which is like those extremes. And it's almost like this thing that we haven't really always got to know how that first of all, we haven't always identified that we were doing that. So we were not aware we were taking like refuge in those behaviors, but actually that there is a middle way, and that there is a process where people we can kind of come back to our core again. So I'd love to hear from you a little bit about, having created this course, how many kind of sections in the course do you have? And
so sorry, the screen was
there's
a little bit
of a delay.
There's a bit of a jumping. So so just what you're saying there, this is what I address in the course, is the fact that this aspect of us is kind of like a false self, like a shell personality, or a kind of a scaffolding. So we're clinging on for dear life and behaving in these ways, and we don't realize there's like a truer core self that we can rest in, and kind of surrender to. But in order to do that, there's a certain kind of gradual process of unpeeling the layers, really, starting with the challenging behavior that we're seeing in our lives. So that what the course does is it looks at, there's kind of this like three core modules, we'll say, and then the kind of an introduction and a moving forwards section. But the meat of the work really is identifying and unpeeling the layers of the inner critic, and noticing how it shows up in your life. And then looking at, why is it there? What is it even trying to do for you? Why is this like miserable part of us that causes so much suffering and is so limiting? Why is it there? And looking at the ways that it's not actually the enemy. So that's very personal kind of work. So that we're really trying to engage from our more I suppose healthy, mature selves, create a little bit of space around it, a bit of a feeling of safety, so that the space to actually explore and engage some curiosity and not be in a panic about it, and very gradually, carefully start exploring, you know, how the inner critic was trying to protect you when you were little, and what was going on, what was the atmosphere in your kind of holding environment, you know, as a child, that was creating a sense of unsafety. What were you criticized for, like outright? You know, what did teachers say to you? Sometimes it's really obvious stuff, like you were told something about your art project that was really shaming, or you were, you know, stood up in front of your class. But it's going back to the really earliest, and it's not like a sort of you know, self psychotherapy in the sense of just always going back into the past, but it's looking at what's your sense of what this part of you is telling you? What are the triggers? Yeah. And then we start looking at, you know, what's the underlying experience that it was protecting you from, which is very often shame and fear, confusion, you know, humiliation, chaos, just feeling very like unsafe and out of control. So, you know, it's work that needs to be done with a bit of respect, a lot of respect and a lot of care and compassion, and takes a lot of courage, because we're kind of gradually looking at minding those parts of ourselves and healing those parts of ourselves that are fueling the inner critic, you know.
And I love from what you're describing, because a lot of the process in engaging to start grappling with the inner critic sounds very much like similar process to shadow work, the befriending aspect. And in a way, but I love how you identified it also as a subsection of shadow work. It's not the only, it's one of the areas, because there's other areas of shadow work as well, other segments to it. Shadow work is the umbrella, I guess, in a way, and that aspect is one of it, right? And I guess what I want to ask now, which I'm very curious about, and I think briefly in a conversation earlier you mentioned, is this the only way people go about, like, obviously when we realize that our inner critic is running the show or has taken over a little bit, or is kind of like we making decisions from that place, and we start to become aware. Is the befriending the only way, in your experience as a psychotherapist, I guess, your practice, how people engage with the work of the inner critic, like, or, you know?
No, there's many other ways. So that is kind of so
or responses, if not the processes, or the responses, some of the varied responses we can have around when we discover, you know.
We need a whole panel, we need a toolkit with the inner critic, because it is the primary shadow aspect that we need to engage with, you know. And your work is very much about, you know, the magical doors between the seen and the unseen. So the seen is the painful behavior of the inner critic, is the thing that we see and that comes up moment by moment every single day. It's the most obvious one, you know. So the inner critic shadow aspect is just the biggest one to work with. And the ways to work with it. So in the course, I go through 10 ways to identify it in your life.
That's powerful.
10 ways to understand what it's doing, like 10 things to know about your inner critic. That it's not the real you, it's there to protect you, you know, it originally has positive intentions. There's lots of kind of you know, to kind of understand it a little bit more. And then 10 of the most kind of common strategies that my clients have adopted, that, you know, I've learned from them as well, and that I've adopted, and that I've just kind of come to the fore over the years as being helpful strategies. Because again, our mind has this very like linear and kind of limited way of thinking, okay, here's the process. But really a lot of it is about coming back into the body, into where the shame lives. You know, embodiment and presence is a huge aspect of this work. So staying on the edge of that discomfort of the trigger, you know. And then so befriending is a lovely way to do it when you're at that point, but initially very often people talk about defending against the inner critic,
that rings a bell.
Fuck off kind of a vibe, you know. So it's like you can be really, and you can use strong language, like whatever helps you. And again, the inner critic gets in the way of how you work with the inner critic. So it's literally like, I'm doing this wrong, I'm not getting it right, don't understand what she's written there, you know. Or the inner critic has got in the way of my own personal psychotherapy process. It's there all the time, like, you're not being a very good client, oh, you're not a good therapist because da, 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 da. Like, it's constant and it's exhausting. So the more you catch it, the better. So often at the beginning you need quite strong strategies where you're really engaging your will, the part of you that might have been quite broken down as a child or not supported to express, to be like, no, you know, back off, I want to do this. And there's a bit of a fight, you know, going on. You're not going to ruin this experience for me. And you're really bringing the kind of the fire, you know, element in. So that's one way to do it. I like that. And then, you know, if you Google stuff about the inner critic, everyone has their strategies of choice. but it's really finding what works for you.
Yes.
So for you, so something,
Yes.
humor is such an important one in my work and in my personal life, for you as well. One of the reasons I connected with you as a coach,
I
was
love
when you shared experiences of just like being able to laugh at yourself, you know, not to diminish the suffering, to really honor, you know, and respect the dignity of the suffering it causes, but to be able to just be playful,
to be honest,
you know, your own organic language, and just kind of like laugh / cry about it, because that's so healing. It gives permission, you know, there's a bit of space around it then. It's not this like tight battle.
For me, it's where humor was born through the suffering, to be honest with you.
Exactly.
If anything, it's become deeper, bigger, and in some cases kind of just a little bit more kind of eccentric or whatever, but actually it has been born through suffering. It's not in isolation of it. And you know, I think the ancient Greeks had a thing about comedy and tragedy, right? In theater, and playing with the archetypes of that. And I think it's very, very closely linked. But no, I really love that you bringing this in, actually. I'm really enjoying you mentioning that, you know, the approaches are really important, and how we go about healing our relationship with our inner critic, or disentangling, or whatever the words that kind of will connect the most with people. Because I think that we do need, like, I worked in, you know, with vulnerable people with complex needs for about 15 years in domestic violence, mental health, you know, learning disabilities. And it was always, when you work in the charity sector, it was always about the personable, like, support. And although my counseling was around integrative as opposed to person-centered, but person-centered packages were always the way forward, like where it really addresses a person as they are, what they bring to the table. So the fact that you created a course that not only highlights the ways we can go about identifying our inner critic, but also heal the relationship in that very personable way that suits our approach, is really important. Because also I'm just thinking how, for some people who went through whatever trauma they have experienced, and the idea of befriending might feel a little bit like, I don't want to befriend it. I want to, like,
definitely.
You know, so there's something about that can feel important. Yet on the another person said, no, I need more of that befriending rather than the getting into the really defense or bringing the rebel. So there's as many ways as there are people, almost, in a way, really.
For sure. And even the inner critic has a different voice depending on, say, like, if you know your Enneagram type, it sounds very different, you know. But just to go back to what you're saying there, that's really, really important, because some people need to really, I think separating out that voice as a different aspect of ourselves is really important. So giving it a name is another strategy. So, you know, I know people who call their inner critics really funny things, and sometimes they're like more poignant and sad things, you know, that really tell you a lot about it. I know quite a few people who call their inner critic like toxic asshole or toxic bitch. Like, it's really interesting. And mine has definitely been just toxic and violent at times as well. All the internalized shit, you know, from being a human, and being a human in a woman's body, and all. And
also the fact that it's a relationship that changes, right?
It
so
totally
in a way, our relationship connection with inner critic will shift as we get to work in that relationship. And it's okay maybe to validate that. It's okay for it to be angry to start with, and then to start
and to acknowledge the violence and the abuse that it has caused as well. And also, if you've, you know, and we've all experienced, it's not just about the obvious traumas. I want to make that really clear. You know, you can be raised in the most loving family with the most benevolent parents, and they're still going to, like, mess things up, you know, because that generation wasn't supported. Like, the amount of, you know, and it's instantly, it's like, well, don't betray your parents, because there's a huge loyalty to those who raised us. That's a really important point as well here. A lot of the work with the inner critic is unpeeling the unconscious loyalty we have to replaying the same frustration and pain and kind of the same tone of being, you know, wounded. We do to ourselves what was done to us. So we're constantly saying the same things to ourselves. But also, so just on that piece of, you know, to acknowledge that if it was very abusive and the stuff that you heard was awful, and often it was, like, even if you think of like nursery rhymes and kids stories and like certainly in the French cultural context, my God, some of this stuff is so weird and misogynist, and what's normalized is just totally messed up. When I'm reading books to my niece now, me and my sister are like, we might not
throw that one away.
That's friggin' strange, you know, and even like kind of pop song lyrics or whatever. So we internalize all of this, and then if you have a particularly abusive, you know, upbringing, or you were just, shamed and ridiculed all the time. It was kind of well-meaning and jokey, but it's really shaming to
or
a
even
child,
unwitnessed
or
and neglected.
unattuned to,
Yeah.
not witnessed. It's
Yeah.
deeply wounding to a very vulnerable child who needs adults to survive. And then there could be like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. So you call your inner critic what you want. You might not even want to call them something, but it's helpful to kind of personify it as a part, a subsection of you that had to get set up to help you
Separate entity
survive,
as well. Yeah.
and separate it out. So you could call it like Jim or Bob or, Jemima, whatever you want. Like some people, also it's very clear it's a male voice. And for others, it's a female voice. Others aren't so sure. It's just this kind of amorphous. You can draw your inner critic, lots of things.
This is so juicy. I'm loving having this conversation.
It's I would love to be able to say, like, I'm done with inner critic work. I don't want to talk about this forever. Let's move on to the juicy, flowy, soul expression stuff.
Yeah.
You cannot. The two are connected.
Yeah. I started becoming quite like interestingly diplomatic with mine in terms of how I bring it into my relationship with my son. To give you an example, like I always hated the word stupid, and I just made a point. I used it once when my son was younger and said it out loud, and not to him, but I immediately, as I said it, I thought like, oh no, this was really, and we talked about it. I called someone stupid, not in front of their face, but it was my son was there to witness it. Oh, he's stupid, and because of something he did, it was misbehaved, and I kind of like, I hated it, but I now realize I'm becoming a bit more because I mean, obviously it was for another person, but it's also kind of an inner thing, right? Like your inner critic to yourself, my own judgment, and absolutely. I've called myself stupid many times, but I made it conscious not to do it to myself. But now that he's older, I'm allowing my inner critic to show itself, because in the comfort of your home, you relax a little bit more, and your shadow is a little bit more kind of not as controlled. And I kind of like, you know what I mean? And I feel like it feels less urgent to protect him from some of my shadow. And it's weird to say that, because he's a little bit more robust, he's a little bit older. Even with you know what I mean? He's 8 now. And
so that's first the 3 years of the psychological birth, and then the 7 years. So I
was feel like, let's try and do the best. Like, let me try and keep it as tight as possible whilst he's up until 6, and then I can relax a bit, which is ridiculous. But also, we had a conversation in bed, because I did not protect him really well. I've acted in ways that was really shameful when I was going through some intense healing in the early stages of him being a child. And it was so embarrassing. And he remembers that well. And he sat me 2 weeks ago to have a conversation about this. And I'm really glad he did. And I had to talk to him and say, look, Chaska, this happened, and, it's really awful, and it shouldn't have happened. And I'm sorry you had to experience it. Mm-hmm. And I felt like, I was going through some healing at the time, and I was going through some pain. And he's in that age where we could have that conversation, but also like, I love that he could talk to me about it. And I felt like, can I ask you, do you feel safer with me now? Do you feel that things have changed? And he, what he did is,
yeah.
So I was like, relieved.
So
it was great. He said, oh, Mom, totally. And I really love it, because you know what? It sounds to me that you're doing the work so you don't repeat what your family did or how they were. And I feel like this is really special.
It's so profound. And I just spent 3 days minding my niece. And the thing to say is, it's not to be sort of like sanctimonious and like, aren't we so much better? We're always doing the best with the tools that we have. That's always the case.
Can I be honest with you? Yeah.
It doesn't mean we have to like say permission to be a dickhead. You know what I mean? There's a nuance there. But yeah.
But I'll be honest with you, and here's the thing, because I held myself, my parents accountable for that, and I held myself accountable. I didn't always do the best, and I knew I could do better. And I just feel like I was just overspilling, and I just like, and it wasn't that it happened too much of it or whatever, but it was enough for that to have an impact. And I won't always know the impact, but I caught myself at times where I just like, I'd like to think that I always did my best, but I don't know that I always chose my best. And I think there's something about saying that, like, sometimes we won't always choose it. And it might be because we do the best at the time, or because that's the capacity we had, but it might be that we just didn't choose it. and I don't have the answer to that, and it's not necessarily a thing about,
No,
like
it's
I
a
need
good
to find the
point, but I
answer.
think it is
I
important.
wonder about that. I'm not convinced. This is what I want to say. I'm not convinced that I always chose the best. And I think that it's something that I'm owning about what
Yeah.
I know about that time.
But that very kind of, true honesty, self-honesty, and you kind of have to feel the ughness of that, because a lot of this work is grief work. That's another thing I wanted to say, is a lot of this is the
Yes.
loss and grief. So
Yes.
it gives you permission then to say, maybe I didn't really do my best. So when I say that, it's like if you didn't choose the optimal version,
Yes.
there's some
Yes.
reason. There's
Yes.
some reason.
There was,
And it could be apathy or whatever, but it doesn't mean that you don't have to strive for more. It's just kind of
yes.
saying, there was something going on. I was like a less than ideal human. So let's just stay curious about that, because otherwise you're in the loop, the same
And
loop
of course,
never being allowed to change,
and I think for me I wasn't feeling safe in my life at the time. There was a sense of like I didn't have the
Yeah.
support system that I needed, and but so there was that as well. But I love it's interesting, isn't it, when the inner critic, it's like, now for me it's like there's this a little bit more control behavior about what I can bring in, and what to the level of robustness he has, the fact that he's a social media kid, in the sense of like he watches YouTube, he has a YouTube channel, he does, and it's like he watches things, he observes, he talks with a language, with his, like I hear some of the language that his friends or whatever kids at school use, and he's grown up. Their generation is a lot more grown up to my generation,
Definitely, there's outside influence as well, but also, your self-awareness. I mean, I would say that even when I think, and you know this, but like behaving badly as a parent, or doing something that you'd rather not have done, that's shameful, or that feels damaging, and then owning that and having a conversation around it is so much more nourishing to the child.
I think
than
so.
constantly being with your superego / inner critic in this constant kind of repressive, like that's actually more of the superego saying you shouldn't be like this as a parent. It's really rigid and it's not organic, and it blocks you from actually having an open heart and being real. And so, like Winnicott, one of my favorite theorists and practitioners, therapists of all time, who's dead now, always talked about just the good enough environment, and that's all that children really need. They need congruence and honesty, and not for you to be like a fake self.
I resonate that with that.
We all know that, but I would say that, like, you recognizing that those early years are so important. It's so true, because the influences are so, like, it's so impactful.
And actually,
it's not to protect them from suffering or shame. Children will feel shame. They're going to feel suffering. They're going to feel devastation and loss. And then they need to be supported to feel that. It's because we didn't feel those things that we had to construct these character structures of, here's how I live in life, here's how I need to behave, or else all hell will break loose. It's just this panic of rigidity. And like, if I don't follow my inner critic, I'm going to be shamed. And if you know that you can tolerate the feeling of like mild, healthy shame, and Brene Brown talks about that. Like,
I love her. I'm reading her latest book.
Like, we're literally hardwired to have a superego and inner critic. So we all have to engage with it. So there's no right or wrong, it's the more congruent and honest you can be with yourself, the more compassion you can have to melt that structure, and humor, and then grieve, poor little me, like poor me that I had to live through that and felt so, lost and confused. And now I thought I had to be such a competent.
I think I was in the stage of grief, and I think this is the thing. I needed space for it, and I didn't have anybody holding space for me. But there was always apologies. But what I loved about this now is because he's old enough to communicate and needed to share. It felt very healing, because the apology in itself wasn't enough of it. He remembers it, and he could talk about it, and it was just a very healing thing for both of us, but it's turned into a bit of a therapy session there. But I loved hearing what you talked about in relation to how juicy the inner critic is, and how big this work is in a way, and almost like, because it is a little bit hidden, it can happen too fast, and kind of a little bit invisible kind of force in our psychology, in our behavior, and how it impacts our life. It's even more important, therefore, to really do this work, make this work conscious,
Otherwise it's running the show,
It's running the show.
Yeah.
So I loved having this chat with you. Tell me a little bit, Delphine, about, we're going to close now. You have this course. How long will it take people to, and also there's a lovely offer. Delphine is giving a gift to those who are watching this and who are part of my audience who want to do this work. It's a self-paced course, right? So it's got how many modules? So it's,
I should have checked this before because I added one. I wanted to kind of orient people a little bit more. So I think it's 5 modules now because I actually pulled out a bit more of an introduction.
Great.
But what it does include is, so there's information about the inner critic, ways of working through it. And then what I include, which I feel is kind of maybe not so, you might not find this elsewhere, is I bring in the work that you and I are interested in, which is kind of the energy healing aspect and the ritual part. So
beautiful.
You really come through a whole process with it. You do your kind of exploration work, the journaling, self-connection. You can work through it with somebody else. And then when it feels ready, when you've really got some awareness about what a particular inner critic aspect has been doing for you, you work through a nice a beautiful kind of energy clearing and healing meditation to really set the intention that you're completing a process with it and that you're choosing to engage differently.
Great. So creating sacred space around this work.
Really creating a sacred space around this work and creating a kind of a ritual, intentional space. And then there's suggestions for carving out your own beautiful ritual if it resonates with you, and I'm sure a lot of your audience do that kind of work, whether it's kind of elemental or with the cosmic energies and the planetary movements and the moon, the lunar cycles, your own menstrual cycle, whatever it is, and to work with that, whichever elements resonate for you. And that's actually been so healing for me to mark that point of like completion of this doesn't have to plague me anymore. I see where it came from. I get it. It doesn't have to stop me from growing in my work, as a therapist and a healer and a guide. And to kind of mark a moment, draw a line in the sand and say, okay. And then, you're still going to get triggered. So again, not to let the inner critic go, I thought you did the ritual on this. Why are you still behaving like this? It's still going to come in, but probably like less charge, much less charge. You can catch it in action. You can then engage other strategies and you could still move forward in your life without it completely stopping you, so you can still keep going.
So this work, whoever buys this course, they can use it for their own, obviously, development, either in their own personal development or professionally to help them so that they're sort of a bit more of an open vessel for their client work, a bit more of a cleaner vessel for their client work. But also, from what we discussed, they can use some of these tools with the clients. So they can do this work with the clients if they need to. Definitely. They can use it as a tool to help release their client, help their client disentangle from their own inner critic as well, which is really wonderful. And I'm guessing a lot of coaches out there will be really up for having more tools in the toolbox as well.
For sure. And it's a synthesis of everything I've absorbed from so many different teachings and so many decades of inner work from different traditions, kind of, the world of psychotherapy, the kind of more transpersonal psychology and embodied meditation, divine feminine teachings. And you can add in whatever works for you, so it's kind of really practical strategies to work through, kind of like steps. So that was tricky for me to do because my own inner critic was like, you can't synthesize this body of work into something, so kind of clear and discreet. But I did, and I took, negotiating with my own inner critic to actually get this done and some encouragement from others. But it is, it's a really clear kind of process, and then you adapt it to whatever works for you.
It's great. I really love it.
And definitely using it with their own clients because it comes up all the time. It gets in the way of coaching work and healing work all the time.
Thank you so much for having this conversation about such an important topic. And it's very, very kind of you to make this offer as well. So Delphine has kindly offered, the program is basically, it costs 98 euros, which is less in pounds, in British pounds. And she offered a 10 euro discount to everybody watching this. And I will, on the description box, if you're watching on YouTube, or if you want to message me back, or just basically use the link for the course to purchase it with the discount code Samaya88 to get the 10 euro discount. It's very kind of you. Thank you for that. I honestly think this is such valuable work. I think that we need to go back to the core fundamental aspects that are going to help us disentangle. And a lot of the times we kind of approach things, we think there's other things are more important, but actually this is such a foundational thing to create more of that, help us become a cleaner vessel for ourselves and everyone around us, our families, our clients, and so it's a really beautiful offering. So thank you for bringing like decades of personal and professional experience in this to help bring us closer to our true self.
No, it's a total pleasure, and I love that you highlight the importance of this aspect of the work, Samaya, in your own work, because we all want to move to the light.
Yeah.
We want to feel the good stuff, but we just can't avoid working with the shadow, and that's
Yes.
a part of the human experience. So we might as well have good maps to help us. Ultimately, my intention with this work is for more of us to feel our organic soul selves, like our soul child, and the part of us that is, as I said, endlessly creative and can enjoy life. And then you have strategies for when stuff comes up, and you keep kind of drawing on those strategies, so you're equipped to keep kind of moving forward. But the two are just totally interconnected.
Delphine, before we go, just tell me your where people can find you. Give me maybe one, like either social media or website. What's the best place for people to find you?
Probably my website, because all the social media links are on there as well. So embodymytruth.com. And then if you click, it's in the menu actually, the Inner Critic resource is linked through from the resources menu from there. So you can just use the coupon code when you click through.
Great. And I will also put the link of the course itself as a separate, easier for people to access wherever I get to share it. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It's really lovely to reconnect with you. Thank you for bringing this body of work into the world as well. And I'm very excited because I know you're opening up the doors to sharing a lot more with people in a deeper containers in your coaching as well. So a lot of exciting things for people to watch out for. So do keep on connecting with Delphine and her website to see her offerings, because they're really, really beautiful and very deep containers, very sacred containers for women.
Thank you so much. Yeah, as I do more of my own inner critic work, more of the magic comes out.
It does indeed. So
it's worth it.
It really is. It really is for sure. So thank you so much. Have a really beautiful day, everyone who's watching, and Delphine, and I'll speak to you all very soon.
Take care.
Bye.